Your body started losing muscle mass and strength at age 30, not gradually over decades, but measurably predictably at a rate of about 3 to 8% per decade from that point forward. If you're 50 now, you've likely lost 6 to 16% of the muscle mass you had at 30. If you're 60, you've lost 9 to 24%, and if you're 70, you've lost 12 to 32%. This isn't speculation, this is the documented trajectory of sarcopenia, which is the medical term for age-related muscle loss, and it happens to everyone who doesn't actively fight against it. But here's what makes this truly dangerous. Muscle loss isn't just cosmetic. It's not about looking less toned or having less definition. Every kilogram of muscle you lose takes with it strength, metabolic capacity, bone density, insulin sensitivity, and functional independence. When you lose muscle, your risk of falls increases dramatically because you don't have the strength or balance to catch yourself. Your risk of fractures increases because muscle loss is accompanied by bone loss. Your risk of diabetes increases because muscle is where most of your glucose gets stored and used. Your metabolic rate drops because muscle burns calories even at rest, so losing it makes weight management progressively harder. And your risk of mortality increases because low muscle mass is an independent predictor of death from all causes. Studies have shown that people in the lowest quartile of muscle mass have 2 to 3 times higher mortality risk than those in the highest quartile, even after controlling for age, disease, and other risk factors. This is as serious as heart disease or cancer as a health threat, yet almost nobody talks about it until they're already in their 70s or 80s and struggling with basic activities of daily living. Hi, I'm Dr. Alex. I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years in the AAND, I've seen the consequences of muscle loss repeatedly. I've treated elderly patients who've fallen and broken their hip because they didn't have the leg strength to recover their balance. I've seen people in their 70s who can't get up from a chair without using their arms, who can't carry their own groceries, who've lost the ability to live independently because their muscles have wasted away to the point where basic tasks are impossible. And what's heartbreaking is that this decline isn't inevitable. The muscle loss that leads to frailty, falls, and loss of independence is largely preventable and even reversible if addressed early enough. My goal now is to help people understand when muscle loss begins, why it accelerates, and what you can do to prevent or reverse it while you still have time. Now, I know this is concerning information, and you might be wondering whether this channel is worth your time. So let me make you a promise. I promise to keep creating the most helpful videos I possibly can, grounded in research and clinical evidence, to help you understand what's happening in your body and how to protect your long-term health and independence. I'm not here to sell you supplements or workout programs. I'm here to give you the science and the strategies that actually work. All I ask in return is that you give this fairly new channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you get to the end of this video and you don't think it was worth your time, or you haven't learned something genuinely useful, then feel free to unsubscribe. No hard feelings whatsoever. But if you give me your time and attention, I'll give you everything I've learned from over a decade in medicine. So please help me out. Hit that subscribe button to help this channel reach more people like you, and let's continue with the video. To understand why you start losing muscle at 30, we need to understand how muscle mass is maintained throughout your life. Muscle tissue is dynamic, it's constantly being broken down and rebuilt. When you're young, in your teens and 20s, the rate of muscle protein synthesis, which is the building process, exceeds the rate of muscle protein breakdown. This is why young people can build muscle relatively easily and why they recover quickly from exercise. Your hormonal environment supports muscle growth. Testosterone, growth hormone, and insulin-like growth factor are all elevated. Your cells are highly responsive to the anabolic signals from protein intake and resistance training. And your inflammatory levels are low, so there's minimal interference with the muscle building process. But starting around age 30, several things begin to change. First, your anabolic hormone levels start declining. Testosterone decreases by about 1% per year after 30 in men. Growth hormone and IGF-1 decline in both men and women. These hormones are critical for maintaining muscle mass, and as they decline, muscle protein synthesis becomes less efficient. You need more stimulus and more protein to achieve the same muscle building response you got in your 20s. Second, your muscle protein synthesis response to protein intake and resistance exercise becomes blunted. This is called anabolic resistance. When you're young, consuming 20 to 30 grams of protein triggers a robust increase in muscle protein synthesis. When you're older, you might need 40 grams of protein to get the same response. When you're young, a moderate resistance training session stimulates muscle growth effectively. When you're older, you need higher intensity, heavier loads, and more volume to trigger the same adaptive response. Third, chronic low-grade inflammation increases with age. This is sometimes called inflammaging, and it interferes with muscle maintenance. Inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and interleukin-6 activate pathways that promote muscle protein breakdown and inhibit muscle protein synthesis. The more inflamed you are, the harder it is to maintain muscle mass. Fourth, motor neuron loss begins. Motor neurons are the nerve cells that control your muscle fibers. Starting in your 30s, you begin losing motor neurons at a rate of about 1% per year. When a motor neuron dies, the muscle fibers it controlled become denervated and atrophy. Initially, surviving motor neurons can take over some of the orphaned muscle fibers, but eventually the loss accumulates to the point where muscle fibers are permanently lost. And fifth, physical activity tends to decline. Most people are less active in their 40s, 50s, and 60s than they were in their 20s. They're not playing sports, they're working sedentary jobs. They've stopped doing physical labor. And without the stimulus of regular movement, and particularly resistance training, muscle mass declines because there's no signal telling your body that muscle is necessary. The combination of these factors means that starting at age 30, if you're not actively doing things to preserve muscle, you're losing it at a rate of about 3 to 8% per decade. This loss accelerates after age 60 to about 1 to 2% per year, and it accelerates even more dramatically after age 70 to 3% or more per year. This acceleration happens because the mechanisms driving muscle loss, hormonal decline, anabolic resistance, inflammation, motor neuron loss, compound over time. By the time you're in your 70s, you're fighting against decades of accumulated dysfunction, and the muscle loss becomes harder to stop or reverse. The term for severe muscle loss is sarcopenia, and it's diagnosed when muscle mass falls below a certain threshold relative to height, and when that muscle loss is accompanied by reduced strength or reduced physical performance. About 10% of people over 60 have sarcopenia. That percentage increases to 30% or more in people over 80. Sarcopenia is associated with increased fall risk, fracture risk, hospitalization, loss of independence, nursing home placement, and mortality. It's a major driver of frailty, which is the state of being so weak and vulnerable that minor stresses like a cold or a minor injury can cause rapid decline. Now, let's talk about what muscle loss actually looks like functionally, because the numbers are abstract until you understand what they mean in daily life. Losing 10 to 20% of your muscle mass might not sound dramatic, but it translates to losing the ability to do things you take for granted. Grip strength, which is highly correlated with overall muscle strength, declines to the point where opening jars, carrying grocery bags, or holding onto a railing becomes difficult. Leg strength declines to the point where getting up from a low chair or toilet without using your hands becomes impossible. Climbing stairs becomes exhausting or dangerous. Walking speed slows down significantly, which is a predictor of mortality. Studies have found that walking speed below 0.8 meters per second is associated with dramatically increased risk of hospitalization and death. Core strength declines to the point where balance becomes impaired. You become unsteady on your feet. You're at risk of falls, and falls in older adults are catastrophic. Hip fractures have a 1-year mortality rate of about 20 to 30%, meaning 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 people who break their hip die within a year, often from complications of immobility like pneumonia or blood clots. But muscle loss also affects your metabolic health in ways that aren't immediately visible. Muscle tissue is the primary site where your body stores and uses glucose. When you lose muscle, you lose glucose storage capacity, which worsens insulin resistance and increases diabetes risk. Muscle is metabolically active tissue that burns calories even at rest. Losing muscle lowers your basal metabolic rate, which means you burn fewer calories per day. If you're eating the same amount but burning less, you gain fat. This creates a vicious cycle where muscle loss leads to fat gain, which increases inflammation, which accelerates further muscle loss. This is why people often experience body composition changes as they age. They're not necessarily gaining weight on the scale, but they're losing muscle and gaining fat, so they're weaker, more metabolically unhealthy, and at higher disease risk even if their total weight is stable. Muscle also produces myokines, which are signaling molecules that have beneficial effects throughout your body. Myokines improve insulin sensitivity, reduce inflammation, support brain health, and strengthen bones. When muscle mass declines, you lose these protective signals, and your risk of chronic disease increases across the board. The relationship between muscle mass and bone health is particularly important. Muscle and bone are mechanically and metabolically linked. The force that muscles exert on bones through contraction stimulates bone formation. When you lose muscle, particularly if you're no longer doing weight-bearing or resistance exercise, your bones lose that stimulus and they start losing density. This is why sarcopenia and osteoporosis, which is bone loss, almost always occur together. They're part of the same degenerative process. People with low muscle mass have low bone density, and they're at much higher risk of fractures. Women are particularly vulnerable after menopause when estrogen levels drop, because estrogen is protective for both muscle and bone. Postmenopausal women can lose muscle and bone mass at accelerated rates, and if that loss isn't addressed through resistance training and adequate protein intake, the risk of osteoporotic fractures increases dramatically. Now here's the good news: muscle loss is not inevitable. Unlike other aspects of aging that are difficult or impossible to reverse, muscle can be rebuilt at any age if you provide the right stimulus and nutritional support. Studies have shown that people in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s and 90s can gain significant muscle mass and strength through resistance training. A landmark study published in JAMA followed nursing home residents with an average age of 87 who underwent a 10-week resistance training program. They increased their muscle strength by an average of 174%. Some participants doubled or tripled their strength. They went from being unable to stand from a chair to being able to walk independently. Their functional capacity improved dramatically, and this was in people who were frail, in their late 80s, with multiple chronic diseases. The implication is clear. If resistance training can build muscle in 87-year-old nursing home residents, it can work for anyone. The key is understanding what actually works and being willing to commit to it consistently. The single most effective intervention for preventing and reversing muscle loss is resistance training. Not cardio, not yoga, not stretching. Resistance training, which means exercises where your muscles work against an external load, whether that's free weights, machines, resistance bands, or your own body weight. The critical element is progressive overload, which means you're consistently challenging your muscles with loads that are difficult enough to trigger adaptation. If you're lifting the same light dumbbells for the same number of repetitions week after week, you're not creating enough stimulus for muscle growth. You need to progressively increase the weight, the repetitions, or the volume over time. For older adults, particularly those who haven't been training, the initial stimulus doesn't need to be heavy. Even bodyweight exercises or light resistance can trigger muscle growth if the muscles have been untrained. But over time, you need to increase the challenge. Research has shown that older adults need to train at moderate to high intensity, typically 60 to 80% of their one repetition maximum, to maximize muscle growth. This doesn't mean you need to lift dangerously heavy weights. It means the last few repetitions of each set should feel challenging. The second critical factor is protein intake. The current recommended dietary allowance for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, but that's the minimum to prevent deficiency, not the amount needed to optimize muscle mass, particularly in older adults who have anabolic resistance. Research has consistently shown that older adults need at least 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day to maintain muscle mass, and closer to 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day to build muscle. For someone who weighs 70 kilograms, that's 84 to 154 grams of protein per day. That's significantly more than most older adults consume. And the distribution of protein throughout the day matters. You need to consume adequate protein at each meal to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Research suggests that consuming at least 25 to 40 grams of protein per meal, 3 times per day, is more effective for muscle maintenance than consuming the same total amount, spread unevenly or concentrated in one meal. High-quality protein sources that contain all essential amino acids are particularly important. Leucine, which is one of the branch-chain amino acids, is the primary trigger for muscle protein synthesis. And older adults need about 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine per meal to maximize the anabolic response. That's the amount found in about 25 to 30 grams of high-quality protein from sources like meat, fish, eggs, or dairy. The third factor is resistance training frequency and recovery. For older adults, training each major muscle group 2 to 3 times per week is optimal. This provides enough stimulus to trigger muscle growth while allowing adequate recovery between sessions. Recovery becomes more important with age because older adults take longer to recover from training stress. What a 25-year-old can recover from in 24 hours might take a 65-year-old 48 to 72 hours. This doesn't mean training less frequently overall. It means structuring your training so you're not hitting the same muscle groups on consecutive days. A typical effective schedule might be full-body workouts 3 times per week with rest days in between, or an upper-lower split where you train upper body one day, lower body the next, then rest, and repeat. The key is consistency over months and years, not intensity over weeks. Okay, so if you're watching this video, you're probably concerned about losing strength and independence as you age, and you're looking for real strategies that work. I just want to take a few seconds here to remind you that I promise to keep creating the most helpful videos I possibly can, grounded in science and clinical experience, to help you maintain your health and independence for as long as possible. All I ask in return is that you give this channel a chance and hit the subscribe button to help me reach more people like you. If you get to the end and didn't think it was worth your time, feel free to unsubscribe. But if you give me your attention, I'll give you everything I've learned from over a decade in medicine. So please help me out and hit that subscribe button. Let's continue with the video. Beyond resistance training and protein, there are several other factors that affect muscle maintenance. Sleep is critical because muscle protein synthesis and growth hormone release both peak during deep sleep. Sleep deprivation impairs recovery from training, reduces muscle protein synthesis, and increases muscle protein breakdown. Most adults need 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night, and if you're training regularly, adequate sleep is non-negotiable. Chronic inflammation accelerates muscle loss, so addressing sources of inflammation is important. This means controlling chronic diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, maintaining a healthy body weight, eating an anti-inflammatory diet rich in omega-3 fatty acids and antioxidants, and avoiding pro-inflammatory foods like processed carbohydrates and industrial seed oils. Vitamin D is important for muscle function, and deficiency is extremely common in older adults, particularly those who don't get much sun exposure. Vitamin D receptors are present in muscle tissue, and adequate vitamin D levels support muscle strength and reduce fall risk. Creatine supplementation has strong evidence for improving muscle mass and strength in older adults. Creatine helps regenerate ATP, which is the energy currency your muscles use during high-intensity contractions. Supplementing with 3 to 5 grams per day can improve training performance and muscle gain. The timing of when you start matters enormously. If you're 30 or 40 and you start resistance training now, you can prevent most of the muscle loss that would otherwise occur over the next decades. If you're 50 or 60 and you start now, you can stop further loss and rebuild much of what you've lost. If you're 70 or 80 and you start now, you can still gain strength and function, but you're fighting against more accumulated damage and the gains may be slower. The earlier you start, the better your outcomes. But it's never too late to benefit. Even people who start resistance training in their 80s see meaningful improvements in strength, mobility, and independence. The key is not to delay. Don't wait until you're struggling to get out of a chair or you've fallen and broken something to start caring about muscle mass. Start now while you're still strong enough that resistance training feels manageable rather than overwhelming. In emergency medicine, I see the consequences of sarcopenia constantly. I see 75-year-olds who've fallen at home and fractured their hip because they didn't have the leg strength to catch themselves when they tripped. I see 80-year-olds who come in malnourished and weak because they can't shop for groceries or prepare meals anymore due to loss of strength and mobility. I see patients whose muscles have wasted to the point where they can't cough effectively, which leads to pneumonia that becomes life-threatening. I see people lose their independence and end up in nursing homes not because of dementia or terminal illness, but because they're too weak to care for themselves. And the tragedy is that in many cases this decline could have been prevented or significantly delayed if muscle maintenance had been prioritized decades earlier. But I also see the success stories. Patients in their 60s and 70s who've been resistance training for years, who come in for minor issues and have the muscle mass and functional capacity of someone 20 years younger. They recover faster from illness and injury, they maintain their independence, they have better quality of life. The difference isn't genetics, it's behavior sustained over time. What all of this comes down to is understanding that strength and muscle mass are not cosmetic concerns. They're fundamental determinants of your quality of life, your independence, your disease risk, and your lifespan. You start losing muscle at 30, and that loss accelerates with each passing decade unless you actively fight against it. The fight requires resistance training, adequate protein, sufficient sleep, and consistency over years. These aren't complicated interventions. They're accessible to almost everyone, but they require prioritization and effort. You have to make time to train. You have to structure your diet around protein. You have to recover properly. And you have to do this not for weeks or months, but for the rest of your life. The alternative is progressive weakness, loss of function, increased disease risk, and eventual loss of independence. That's the default trajectory for people who don't prioritize muscle maintenance. But it doesn't have to be your trajectory. You have agency here. You can decide at 40, 50, 60, or 70 to start building and maintaining muscle. And that decision will determine whether you're still strong, independent, and active in your 80s, or whether you're frail, dependent, and struggling with basic tasks. Please subscribe to this channel if you found this useful to help me reach more people who deserve to understand how to protect their strength and independence as they age. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.